This is one of a series of lectures that I'm giving in Brentwood Theater once a month, but which this month I'm giving here in Catalina Hall. Usually they're at 4 p.m. on Wednesdays. Now, this is a talk with 3 stages. I call it How an Arrow Aimed at Henry Kissinger Hit Nixon on the Climactic Day of Watergate. And, but it starts with something that's akin to the movie Fair Game. How many people saw this movie Fair Game, which I think was recently shown here? In the movie Fair Game, this man, Joe Wilson, writes a New York Times article saying that President George Bush had told a lie in the State of the Union address, and that he had said the British have learned that that Saddam Hussein tried to buy uranium in Africa, and Joe Wilson had been the ambassador that was sent by the CIA to find out if this was true, and he had gone there, learned that it wasn't true, and so when the president said it had happened, he wrote a New York Times article saying we may have entered the war in Iraq under false pretenses. Now, of course, the movie may not be accurate, but the way it's shown in the movie, the Bush administration decided to retaliate. They outed his wife as a CIA agent, which she was, but it's illegal to reveal the identity of a CIA agent, so that was against the law. And they smeared the husband, Joe Wilson. So what I realized when I saw this movie, Fair Game, was that the exact same thing had happened to me during the Nixon administration. This man, Johnny Foster, was the 3rd ranking official in the Defense Department. He was Director of Defense Research and Engineering. And he was testifying about research and development before the congressional committees. I had many of the hearings of his testimony in my basement, and I began reading them. And I discovered that he was exaggerating the research and development efforts of the Russians in order to get more appropriations from the Defense Department. And I wrote a 50-page report on what he'd been saying and why I thought it wasn't true. And I summarized it as saying that this was a classical numbers game featuring selective disclosure, questionable assumptions, exaggeratedly precise estimates, misleading language, and alarmist non sequitur conclusions. And this got a lot of press. Science Magazine said this is the kind of expert testimony that Congress needs but doesn't have. One reporter said to me, "You've opened the shutters on part of the Pentagon. They don't like it." And the report began to get press, even a cartoon by Herblock, which shows Melvin Laird, who was Secretary of Defense at the time and the boss of Johnny Foster, saying, "More money, the Russians may be outspending us." Well, this created enough of a stir that a normally moribund subcommittee of armed services, the Research and Development Subcommittee, decided to call hearings. This is Senator McIntyre, who was the chairman of the subcommittee. The White House's reaction to this was to put Stone on the enemies list, to out him and smear him. I didn't know I was on the enemies list until the congressional Watergate hearings because the enemies list was secret. When it was revealed, I was somewhat alarmed. No one wants to be on the enemies list of a president. It wasn't politically correct. I was working on Capitol Hill, dealing with congressmen and senators of all kinds. So I was a little bit disturbed about that. And I learned, though, that when the enemies list was revealed, there were about 150 people on it. 20 of them were academics. I was the youngest of the 20, but they included the president of Yale, the president of Harvard, the highest officials in the Kennedy administration, the science advisor to Kennedy and the national security advisor to Kennedy, McGeorge Bundy and Jerome Wiesner. I felt, and Edwin Land, the inventor of the Polaroid camera. I felt I was in pretty good company. They also had Jane Fonda, Bill Cosby, Gregory Peck, and Ted Kennedy. And they had the New York Times and the Washington Post, just for good measure. So I didn't feel so badly when I later learned that, but this I learned later. What I learned immediately came about because of this man, Chuck Coulson. Now, he was running the White House Office of Dirty Tricks. To get even with me, they mobilized Chuck Coulson. Now, Coulson was special counsel to the president for 4 years, and he pled guilty and went to jail for his role in the Watergate. But while he was there, he was called Nixon's hatchet man. And that wasn't an exaggeration. He called himself ruthless because he said that was the only way I could be useful to the president if I were ruthless. And he was ruthless. He had very weird ideas also. At one point, he proposed that the Nixon administration firebomb the Brookings Institute, and then when the firemen came, they would be able to rush in and get a secret document that they thought Brookings had that showed the Nixon administration in bad light. He also suggested they destroy John Kerry at an early stage before he became another Ralph Nader. So that's the kind of ideas he had. He went to jail, and in jail, I don't know what you all think about this, he became a born-again Christian, and he founded a prison fellowship and began to be involved in good works, helping fellow prisoners. This became so widely known that he got $1 million prize, the Templeton Prize, which is given once a year to someone who has done the greatest thing that year to link religion and science. Well, why he got this, I don't know. But I don't think he really changed his spots, because when a completely bogus theory of the Watergate came out, which blamed everything on John Dean, which was a complete absurdity and nobody supported it, he went out on the hustings and supported this attack on John Dean. We'll see more of this later. So I don't really believe that he changed his spots. Well, what he did, though, was he mobilized this man, Joseph Alsop. Now, Joseph Alsop was a real slam-bang columnist and didn't care what he said if he thought he was on the appropriate side. And he had his column was reported in 600 newspapers. He wasn't like his brother Stewart Alsop. They used to write a column together, which was more moderate, but when Stewart Alsop dropped off, Joseph Alsop's thing was stronger. So he started attacking me. He had been told, to get rid of me, and he didn't know anything about me. For example, his column said that this person is an exceedingly left-wing political scientist from Princeton. Now, in fact, I was not from Princeton at all. I was from Stanford. And I was not a political scientist at all. I was a mathematician. And I wasn't exceedingly left-wing either. I was just a garden variety liberal. But Alsop really didn't care. The way he decided to smear me, similar to the movie Fair Game, was to out me. The outing was to reveal to the public that I was the son of the radical journalist I.F. Stone. And he said, I.F. Stone has followed the communist line without a deviation for 20 years, and there's every indication that Jeremy Stone agrees with him. So this was guilt by association in 600 newspapers. And now the fact of the matter is that I.F. Stone turned out, when 1999 came about, there was a vote among fellow journalists to try to decide who had done the greatest journalistic work of the last century. Last century, that's 100 years, fellas. For those here who are over 90, that's 100 years. And he was voted second best print journalist of the 20th century. Alsop wasn't on the list of the 100 best at all. And Harvard began awarding an I.F. Stone medal. That's I.F. Stone's medal with his picture on it, saying journalist, publisher, scholar. And they give this award each year in October to some courageous journalist to try to teach journalists in journalism schools what journalism is supposed to be like. And the award is given in a different journalism school every year to spread the message. And I.F. Stone has had 4 biographies written about him, all very positive. That's more biographies than most presidents get. So Alsop was barking up the wrong tree for I.F. Stone as well. In fact, when I.F. Stone went to Russia in 1956, when it opened up, he came back and wrote in his left-wing journal, this in italics, he wrote, "This is not a good society and it's not run by honest men," which was a surprise to a lot of the people reading his left-wing newspaper at that time, and 400 quit. And all of them might have quit, but he said what he believed anyway. So this was a smear. And the question was, why wasn't I destroyed by it? And the answer is a simple one. It turns out that the scientists, I was running the Federation of American Scientists at the time. They were founded by the atomic scientists, and they were trying to bring about disarmament. They wanted to be sure the bomb they had invented was never used again. If they had been drawn from the average public, I think I would have been thrown out of office on the basis of this smear. Many of my colleagues in Washington dreaded having their name mentioned in anybody's column, and none of them had been smeared the way I was. In fact, I left out that Alsop threw in the idea that the reason Stone had attacked Johnny Foster was because the Russians wanted to get him, which meant I was a traitor helping the Russians get Johnny Foster. So this was the biggest smear anybody had seen. And in fact, the LA Times, which was the home newspaper of the syndicate that was sending this out to 600 newspapers, they refused to publish it themselves. So this article went out to 600 newspapers, but wasn't published in the LA Times itself. Anyway, it turns out, here's an interesting factoid, 75% of all American scientists are liberals. And with engineers, it's quite different. You know, 80%, 90% of the engineers are conservatives. We kept trying to recruit engineers to this organization, failed utterly. But we had 57 Nobel Prize winners and all the scientists, so they didn't care what Alsop said. That's why I survived this smear. Now, this is stage 2 of this talk, and this has to do with Henry Kissinger. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, this is a year after the smear. I was still in business. Of course, I was wearing a pocket handkerchief to try to persuade the senators and congressmen that I was a very respectable fellow, and they didn't have to worry about any radical tendencies. And this is Senator Fulbright with his committee. That's Mr. Hickenlooper on his right, other distinguished senators. Now, they had a problem. I knew the Foreign Relations Committee quite well because the headquarters of the Federation of American Scientists was 100 yards from the Foreign Relations Committee, and I would walk over there every day, prowling around the halls of Congress, finding useful things to do. And so I knew, I learned from them that they were upset that Henry Kissinger wasn't willing to testify before their committee. Now, the Secretary of State was willing to testify before their committee. That's him. That was Secretary Rogers. But the trouble is, at that time, Henry Kissinger and President Nixon were working up the foreign policy between themselves. And Mr. Rogers didn't get a look in. At that time, you remember, Kissinger was the National Security Advisor. He wasn't yet the Secretary of State, and he had great proximity to the president, and the two of them knew exactly what they were going to do in foreign policy, but Rogers knew nothing about it. So they didn't want Rogers, they wanted Henry Kissinger. So the question was what to do about that. And I started studying the rules about testimony in the White House. I didn't know anything about it, who had to testify, who didn't. It's a complicated subject. And I learned that the White House looked like this. Henry Kissinger was claiming executive privilege. He was saying, I'm a presidential aide. I talked to the president privately, You can't ask me to tell you what I tell the president privately. Now, also in the White House, there were, that's the National Security Council there, right there. But there's these other offices, the Office of Management and Budget, the Office of Policy Development, the Council of Economic Advisors, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Council on Environmental Quality, the Office of Administration, and the Office of the United States Trade Representative. So there were 7 other places besides the National Security Council, and all of them were testifying. What they were doing was they wore 2 hats. For example, the Office of Science and Technology Policy had a scientist. He was called the Presidential Science Advisor. In that capacity, he didn't testify. He gave the president private advice. But he was also considered the director of this Office of Science and Technology Policy. And when the Congress wanted to know what's going on, they called the director of Science and Technology Policy, and that was the same guy, and he would report and testify. And if he didn't, they could zero out his entire budget, because all of these little groups were set up by law, and Congress had set up the law. They could abolish the law or just defund the whole operation. So these people had to report. So I thought about that for a while, and I wrote a newsletter. I wrote 200 of these newsletters over 30 years for the Federation of American Scientists on every damn thing. And this one says at the top, to facilitate congressional testimony, FAS proposes second hat for Henry Kissinger, namely that he should be called the director of the National Security Council, as well as the president's national security advisor. And the way I wrote these newsletters, I did all the work, but I couldn't sort of be the author of all of them. So I would write these editorials, and then I would get famous experts to endorse the editorial, and I would say, reviewed and approved by these experts, this editorial urges such and such, you see. I didn't want to get overexposed, and I needed experts in the different fields to vouch for what I was saying, and of course they would polish the editorials and make sure I didn't make any obvious mistake and so on. So I mailed this out to my 5,000 scientists and some congressmen and senators, and I mailed 2 copies of it to the White House. One to Henry Kissinger. I knew Henry Kissinger because at Harvard, where I'd written 2 books, at the Center for International Affairs, he had been one of 3 directors of the Harvard Center for International Affairs, so he knew who I was, I knew who he was. And I sent one to John Dean, because John Dean was the White House counsel. And I was making legal statements about the legislative right to know, and what does executive privilege really mean, and where did we get it, and what does it come from? Executive privilege came to America from Britain. It's a 600-year-old tradition, and like much of our common law, we got it from the British. So it was a complicated thing, and the right to know was a pretty important topic. So, So then the Washington Post had a diplomatic correspondent named Mary Martyr. He's a great guy. He was their leading diplomatic correspondent. He's still going at age 92, writing his memoirs and helping select who should get the I.F. Stone Medal and things like that. And he wrote about my newsletter right on the editorial page, underneath the cartoon and next to the editorials. And he said, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is upset about Henry Kissinger not testifying. This issue is being pursued more openly by the Federation of American Scientists, who note that presidential advisors often wear several functional hats. He said the committee was tired of Henry Kissinger running everything and not testifying. So within a month, because I think of Mary Martyr, I got a letter from Henry Kissinger. And he was a friendly letter, but he wanted to cut off any campaign that would force him to testify publicly before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he didn't want to adopt this second hat. He didn't really say that. He said, under these unusual circumstances and so on, I've talked to Senator Fulbright, and I've talked to Congressman Morgan, who's the head of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, and they have agreed that I could meet with them periodically in the Blair House. That's the Blair House. That's right across the street from the White House. That's where foreign dignitaries that don't have any other place to stay overnight when they're meeting with the president. It's an official kind of residence for visitors, so a distinguished place. But it wasn't like testifying on Capitol Hill where somebody takes notes and there's a record of it and the congressman can study it. So one question is, why did Senator Fulbright and Congressman Morgan sell me out here and not get behind a campaign to have him wear this second hat? And I'm quite sure the reason was that they preferred to talk to him privately because they'd get more out of him. And they also felt that private discussions with Henry would be more productive. Now, about a month later, I got a letter back from John Dean. I invited John Dean, by the way, to attend this lecture. He lives in Los Angeles, and we've had some friendly telephone conversations, but he's traveling and couldn't come. He wrote this letter to me saying, no president has ever claimed blanket immunity for White House aides testifying. In other words, he said, the letter says, this is a very interesting newsletter, and you've asked, do we claim that executive privilege covers these aides? And the key line in the letter was, no president has claimed blanket immunity for White House aides testifying. After Watergate, after Dean was out of the White House, when I was writing my memoir about this, I called him to ask about this, and he pointed out, as you probably all know, that no one in Washington signs the letters they write, and no one writes the letters they sign. So, he was very busy. He said, I don't remember this letter, but, somebody had written this letter. As you will see, that didn't make any difference. Now, within a year, President Nixon, a year later, 11 months later, President Nixon was in hot water. And Watergate was really peaking, and Congress wanted John Dean to testify. And so President Nixon said, and this is a picture of him saying these very words. You see, he's somewhat frazzled. This is top of peak period in Watergate. He said, the White House staff will not appear before a congressional committee. So this was big news all over the papers. And now we're turning for a moment now to the climactic day of Watergate. 3 things happened on the climactic day of Watergate, of which I was involved in one. The first thing that happened was that Dean went to the president and said, look, there is a cancer on your presidency. There's a cancer within, close to the presidency, that's growing. We have a most troublesome thing here, because Bob Haldeman's involved in it, John Ehrlichman's involved in it, I'm involved in it, Mitchell, the Attorney General, is involved in it, and it's an obstruction of justice. And Howard Hunt was blackmailing the White House and saying, if you don't give me money, I'm going to tell what's been going on. And so President Nixon told Dean that the blackmail money should be paid. Well, that was enough to make him part of the conspiracy, because paying blackmailers to cover up, not to talk about a crime, is a crime. So, and actually, the president had a talk with Haldeman earlier than this, we now know from the tapes, and it said to Nixon, it said to Haldeman, well, they have to be paid. That's all there is to it. They have to be paid. Otherwise, we have no options. In the White House, the way it was organized, not everybody knew everything the president knew. People reported to him at different times. Dean knew a lot, but he didn't know what Haldeman was reporting to the president. Now, so that was the first thing that was happening on the climactic day of Watergate. Dean was telling the president that the president was in trouble, which of course the president already knew, but to have your White House counsel tell you this, it's a serious matter. Now, also on that day, Ehrlichman and Haldeman were working to blame Dean in order to protect the president. In other words, the White House staff needed a scapegoat. And they wanted Dean to write a report on this whole matter and to fall on his sword, really. And the way they were organizing it was that the president asked Dean to go to Camp David, his vacation residence, spend the weekend at Camp David, and write a report for me on everything you know about Watergate. And of course, once he wrote it all down, they were going to use that to say, you see, he knew all that stuff. And he was going to be blamed for it. But I think in the corridors, he ran into Haldeman and Nixon, and they suddenly were laughing, and they suddenly stopped laughing when they saw him. And he decided that he was going to be made the fall guy. And there was probably other evidence, but small things make a difference. And so he began taking precautions. Now, the third thing that happened on that day involved this man, Raoul Berger. Now, Raoul Berger was the world's expert on executive privilege. Whenever there was hearings on executive privilege, he would be called to testify. He had spent many years in musky libraries learning about how the British understood executive privilege, what it all meant. He was the only person that testified that really knew what he was talking about. He was a friend of mine, partly because his son had graduated from college with me. And whenever he came to testify, I would have lunch with him in the Senate cafeteria, and we would chat. And so when I got the letter from Dean a year before, which was on executive privilege, I had sent him a copy, and he had been interested in it. Now, on this climactic day, I heard from him, and he said, can I quote that letter you've got from John Dean? And I suddenly thought, Jeremy, for God's sakes, you have a letter in the files that bears on this, you know? Get this letter out. So I got this letter out, looked at it, and I decided to release it. Now, I was 100 yards, as I mentioned, from the Senate office building, and in the Hart building, there was an unmarked office where the staff of the Watergate committee was sitting and doing their work. The Watergate committee was run by this man, Senator Sam Erwin, and he had been pounding the table, saying, if I don't get the testimony of some of these White House aides, I am going to have them arrested and put in the basement of the Congress, which hadn't been done for 150 years. He had to say that because the executive branch wasn't going to help him arrest anybody. He was going to send out marshals, you know, marshals from the Congress. Grab these guys, put them in the dungeon of the Congress. And so Sam Erwin, who was like one of the founding fathers, you know, was really exercised about this. And on his right was Sam Dash. Now, Sam Dash was a wonderful lawyer, and he was the general counsel for the committee. So I knew where Dash was, you know, I knew where the Watergate committee was. So I went to this unmarked door. I knocked on the door. Sam Dash opened the door himself. I handed him the letter. I said, Mr. Dash, this is the smoking gun. He closed the door. And the next day, this was big news. The New York Times wrote an article with 4 paragraphs about this, and the Washington Post wrote an article about it too, about this letter. You see, what it made it newsworthy was Dean was the one that the Congress wanted to talk to. Nixon had said none of these staff aides are going to testify. But Dean was also the White House counsel, and he was telling what the law was to Stone and saying, well, we never said nobody could testify. So this was really too sweet for the newspapermen. They went crazy over this. I had long conversations with them. How'd you get this letter? How did this happen? You know? So it got a lot of attention. And after the New York Times came out with 4 paragraphs about it, if you look at Haldeman's memoir, where he kept careful notes of what was happening, the Attorney General, that's Mitchell, said to Haldeman, you know, the only real problem the president has is executive privilege. In other words, this letter to me from John Dean had really accentuated the main problem the president had, which was to shut up everybody that knew about it under the label executive privilege. Now, the Washington Post, this is the Dean letter, by the way. This is a picture of the letter that Dean sent me. You know, there's his signature, which somebody affixed to this letter that somebody wrote. And And there is an excerpt of the Washington Post editorial, Privilege, Precedent, and Mr. Dean. And what the Washington Post said was, there's no better evidence of the slippery, spurious nature of Mr. Nixon's current claim than this letter from Dean to Stone. And the Post called it a footnote in history. And they observed that President Nixon had had the opposite position on executive privilege when he was a congressman, when he wanted the testimony of Edward U. Condon, who was the head of the Bureau of Standards. I was very amused by this because Edward Condon was a family friend. He was head of the Bureau of Standards, which was near our residence in Washington. I knew his children. And he actually wrote the recommendation to me to go to college at MIT. I might add that when the secretary typed the recommendation, she said to Condon, if he's so good, why doesn't he go to Harvard? So you see, Condon was a good friend of mine, and so I was happy to have scored a point against the way he was treated. So Dean did testify. Dean did testify, and his testimony was critical. As you see, the Time magazine said, can Nixon survive Dean? Those of you who remember this, remember that Dean had an uncanny memory and was very well briefed, knew all the dates and facts, and all the efforts to trip him up failed. Still, however, it was still the president's word against Dean's. And of course, the president was saying this is all a lie. But then, during the hearings, Butterfield revealed from the White House that there were tapes, and that the president had taped everything all the time he was in the White House. And those tapes vindicated Dean, because they actually had the conversation that Dean had with the president, in which the president said, well, they have to be paid the money. So the president resigned. It took about a year. It was amazing to me, and it was amazing to the president, that he was able to survive so long with so much documented outrage from the tapes and from Dean and from the Watergate burglars and all the rest. And at one point, I want to emphasize this because it relates to something I'm going to say later. At one point, the president said to Haldeman and Ehrlichman, he said, they want to believe, that's it, isn't it? And what he meant was, the Nixon supporters, they wanted to believe in him. You know, they had elected him president. They had put faith and trust in him. It's a big thing if you have to divest yourself of that trust and faith. And so he was right. They wanted to believe. And so he was able to hang on for a long time. Dean's testimony in the tapes did him in. And Senator Goldwater, who had run for president earlier, was a very senior Republican senator, and two other senators called on President Nixon and told him, you have to resign. We can no longer support you. The Senate will impeach you, And so he resigned. Now, this particular administration was a rather unusual administration. I mean, no president had ever been forced to resign in American history. The vice president of this administration, Mr. Agnew, was also forced to resign for corruption reasons. The attorney general of this administration, who was supposed to support the laws, went to jail. And the senior aides, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, and 6 other people, all went to jail. So this was an amazingly corrupt administration by American standards. And John Dean began thinking about this. He had played such a role in it. He began writing books about this. And this is a picture of John Dean speaking. That's Goldwater there, Senator Goldwater. And this is Senator Goldwater's son. Dean had been a classmate of Senator Goldwater's son at a military academy that Goldwater had also graduated from, and they were all friendly. And Dean had been chief minority counsel to the House Judiciary, and then he worked for the Attorney General, and then he went to the White House. And after this happened, he went to Goldwater and he said, we should write a book about this. Goldwater had written a wonderful book, which many of you may know, called Conscience of a Conservative, expressing his philosophy. And Dean and Goldwater decided they would write another book called Conservatives Without Conscience. And it was an effort to try to find out, how did this happen? We didn't think conservatives were like this. Then Goldwater fell ill before they could both do this. But I have to say that I had personal experience with Goldwater once that showed what a decent man he was. Someone in his office had written something about the Federation that was demeaning of some kind. I've long since forgotten what. But I wrote Senator Goldwater, I said, this reference to the Federation of American Scientists is, not true. We're a patriotic, good group, whatever it was. And Senator Goldwater actually went to the floor of the Senate and read something into the congressional records, straightening this all out and saying he didn't believe what this had been said. Now, this is an extraordinary thing. Few other senators, left or right, would have taken the trouble to straighten out what some aide had done. So I felt Goldwater was a decent man. And what Goldwater was complaining about to Dean was social and cultural conservatives who thought they were acting in the name of God. Goldwater said, politics is give and take, but we can't do give and take with these people because they are so self-righteous and sure that they are right. Goldwater was saying, Dean was saying, conservatism is not inherently moralistic, negative, arrogant, condescending, and self-righteous. But Dean said, those terms did describe the political outlook of contemporary conservatism. And he in particular blamed the second George Bush, Dick Cheney, Tom DeLay, Newt Gingrich, and Bill Frist. He said in the book he wrote, conservatism has been co-opted by people with authoritarian tendencies. Now what does it mean, authoritarian tendencies? Dean had found the work of this man, Bob Altemeyer, who had written a book, The Authoritarians. And he'd been very taken with it. If you want to know what an authoritarian is, there's one sentence which I'll put to you. And if you agree with this, you're probably an authoritarian. And if you don't agree with this, you're probably not. Of course, they had 32 questions in the questionnaire, but this was a key question. And the question was, here's the statement. Our country desperately needs a mighty leader who will do what has to be done to destroy the radical new ways and the sinfulness that are ruining us. Now, if that strikes a chord in you, if that's the way you feel about things, we need a mighty leader. Our country desperately needs a mighty leader who will do what has to be done to destroy the radical new ways and the sinfulness that are ruining us. Then Altemeyer would have put you down as one of the authoritarians. According to Altemeyer, 20 to 25% of the American public were authoritarian. They wanted strong leaders and they wanted to follow those leaders. He said they travel in tight circles. They base their thinking on what they're told. They harbor numerous double standards and hypocrisies. They're hostile towards minorities. They see the world as a dangerous place, teetering on the brink of self-destruction from evil and violence. They're self-righteous. They think of themselves as far more moral and upstanding than others. And this was what was making, Goldwater thought, politics in Washington very difficult. You see, not all presidents are like this, and certainly not all Republican presidents are like this. I had dealings with President Ford, a very sweet and decent man. And the first George Bush, he would never have hurt a flea in an immoral or arrogant way. But according to Dean, the party was drifting in that direction. Now, I want to tell you something about fish and what is leadership. Would you believe that a blind fish can become the leader of the school? Now, I want to discuss that for a minute. If you blind a fish, why does that promote him to leading the school of fish? This is an important question. Think for a minute about what these fish are doing. They're schooling around like this, you see? The fish have different ideas about where to go, and they're trying to reach a consensus on where to go, so they're schooling around. And, but they don't want to be left apart from the school. They definitely don't want to go in a direction the rest of the school is going, because that is death. They would be isolated and alone. But if you blind a fish, he can't look around over his shoulder. He can't see, where is everybody else going? So he just goes directly. He doesn't swerve. He doesn't deviate. He doesn't show uncertainty. As far as the other fish are concerned, he has charisma. He seems to know what he's doing. So they follow him. Now, of course, he may lead them into the rapids. Who knows? He may lead them to destruction. But they do know that he seems to know what he's doing. For example, Joan of Arc. You remember Joan of Arc. She had visions. People followed her. She spoke with conviction because the conviction came from the visions. She'd actually seen it, and she spoke with conviction about it. Now, scientists now think that it had been a wet winter before she had her experience, and that the rye bread, which often got moldy, produced LSD. And so you could have visions, from eating moldy rye bread. But if the visions left you speaking with convictions, people would follow you. In other words, leadership requires giving the impression that you're not going to swerve or change your mind, that you know clearly what you want to do. And sometimes if a leader is morally blind, he can get that kind of strength. For example, Hitler was morally blind. So he was able to do terrible things. But he spoke with great conviction, and the German people followed him. And many books have noted that there was a high percentage of authoritarian personalities in Germany who liked taking orders and giving orders, and they all went together under someone that seemed to know what he was doing. And when you listen to your preachers preach to you with conviction. They are trained to speak with conviction. I've listened to preachers with real interest on Sunday mornings, you know what I mean? This is the way it is, and this is the way it is. And that's the way people want to be told, and a lot of people want to follow it in that way. But it's very important to recognize that following is easier than thinking. And the brains that we have, the frontal lobe was formed last. And there's things underneath it that decide, not from logic, who we follow. People sniff each other out in Washington, and the guy smells right, they work with him. If he doesn't smell right, they don't work with him. Logic and politics plays one role in it, but they decide who they want to work with, the way you decide who you want to be friends with, from a lot deeper analysis. And it is said that people decide whether they like somebody in the first 30 seconds after they meet them. So this whole question of leadership is confronting the fact that we are animals. The frontal lobe was slapped on later. An awful lot that goes on in politics, as any politician will tell you, is not logical. Now, the problem we all face is that the White House power magnifies personality. I once wrote a newsletter, one of the 200 newsletters I mentioned, compared Speer's biography of how it was working with Hitler. He was the great economic builder in the Third Reich. And Khrushchev's memoir about Stalin, and Reedy's memoir about Lyndon Johnson. And when you read those memoirs together, you saw all of these people were working in what amounted to a court. The people around these leaders all wanted to do instantly what the leaders said. No one wanted to question. With some of them, that would have been immediate death. And there was a tension in there which made it true that whatever the presidents wanted, they got. And the presidential aides, when they picked up the phone and said, this is the White House calling, this is what the president wants you to do, people did it. So there was a feeling of power around there, and if there was any flaw in the personality of the leader, it would find itself magnified in the power the president had. So if you elect a leader who is arrogant or vindictive or prone to anger or impulsive, it can have tremendously dangerous effects on the ship of state. In some ways, it's more important to assess the presidential candidates on their personality than on their policies. Because when the policies come up, most new presidents can't do anything very different from what the last president did because the policies of the United States are so locked in. But their personality can make a big difference in how they do it, and it can cause a lot of trouble. So that's my conclusion. I hope this speech is not too political for you. My conclusion is, whatever the party of the candidate, you really should think a lot about their personality. And one of the things Dean mentioned, again, this book by Reedy was done by Lyndon Johnson's press secretary. But John Dean wrote a review of this book. And he said, you know, the people in the White House then, and when I was there, they were often young and impressionable. And they were willing to take orders that went beyond what they would have done if they were older. You know, there's a psychologist named Milgram that used to do an experiment in which he would tell people, okay, we're doing an experiment, we want you to give an electric shock to this person, you know, and the person they were giving the electric shock to would be showing all kinds of pain and suffering. He wasn't, it was a fake, he wasn't actually suffering, but he was pretending to suffer, and the experimenter was saying, yeah, give him the shock, it's part of the experiment, give him the shock, you have to give him the shock. And then they would record how quickly did people come to their senses and decide not to torture this poor person, and how long did they take orders from someone who seemed to be in a position of authority. And this was Milgram's method of measuring the degree to which people had an authoritarian personality. And what Dean said in this review was, really, the people in the White House, if they're in their 20s and 30s, they're too quick to go along. And if he had been older, he would have quit sooner. So I think that's an important observation. And he also observed that the way the White House is constructed, the president dealt with people in very compartmentalized ways. So very few people really got to know what the personality of the president was like. They weren't having family dinner with him every evening, you know. Some people worked in the White House for years and only went into the Oval Office once or twice. So it took a long time for people to figure out what the president was really like. And when he's up before the cameras, you get a very focused, somewhat unreal view. So that's my conclusion. Vet the personalities of the candidates. Thank you very much. And now I'm prepared to fend off questions.
This may be a bit of a non sequitur, but what was the Chinese reaction to the demise of Nixon's presidency, since they had invested so much in that chance?
I don't know, but I know that they continued to roll out the red carpet for Henry Kissinger, and Henry Kissinger continued to support them, and that became their link. And of course, Henry Kissinger continued to be a very powerful figure here, so the policy towards China didn't change. I want to take this occasion to thank Jen for teaching me how to do PowerPoint, without which these talks would be a hell of a lot less effective. Altemeyer.
And it said performed by. The Altemeyer slide said, it looked like a book, but it said performed by.
Yeah, I don't know what that means, but it was a book. It is a book. He'd been writing about the authoritarian personality for decades, and when Dean came upon this book, he thought, that's it. And all the problems that he felt conservatism was having were sort of revealed to him in a flash, that this was the problem. I do think that the Republican Party under Ford and when Goldwater ran, it wasn't as confrontational as it is now. And one of the reasons it became so was the Roe versus Wade decision on abortion mobilized a large number of people that previously had been quite religious but uninterested in politics. But that gave rise to the founding of the moral majority, and religious folk got into politics in a way they didn't before. And later Republican administrations learned how to organize and benefit from this. And so I think things got more political.
That statement meant that the book had been recorded and sold as a read book.
Oh, I see. Alan, it means that Altemeyer's book, I get these images from Google Images, and so that image was revealing that a person hard of hearing could read an audio version of it.
Thank you.
Jeremy,
Yeah.
you mentioned that Nixon was the only president threatened with impeachment, but wasn't Andrew Johnson impeached?
Yeah, no, I didn't say that. I said he was the only one forced to resign. Actually, of course, Nixon was indicted by the House of Representatives, but not convicted in the, I think he was in, anyway, he was the only one that resigned, yep.
You mentioned the corruption of the Nixon administration. I wonder, did you have any contact with Peter G. Peterson, who was Secretary of the Interior during that time?
No.
Okay, just wondering.
See, the Federation worked on foreign policy because we were trying to achieve disarmament and an end to the arms race. So we didn't consider ourselves in political affairs. We considered ourselves nonpartisan actors in political contexts, trying to do what we could in political contexts here and in other countries to try to get a meeting of minds on what to do about the arms race. You know, many of you may not, well, I'm going to have to tell you a short story. My first memoir was translated into Russian, and we went to Moscow to present this book, and we were in the Andrei Sakharov Memorial Hall, and BJ was speaking in Russian to help introduce the book. So BJ said at one point, we were privileged, my husband and I, to work on the greatest danger mankind ever faced. And then she broke up over the poignancy of this enormous thing. And when I came back to America, I told some people this moving story, how BJ had made this introduction in Russian and couldn't continue after she said this. And to my horror, a number of people said to me, well, Jeremy, that's very interesting, but what was that great danger? So you see, people like me had lived for 40 years on the expectation that within 30 minutes, the entire United States would disappear, beyond reconstruction. Atomic bombs, you measure what's destroyed, but we had gone on to hydrogen bombs. In a hydrogen bomb war, you measure what's left, and there isn't much left, and the country would never have been able to pull together again. So the people who were worrying about disarmament, you know, we knew what the greatest danger mankind ever faced was. And we thought everybody else did too. And maybe they did then. But shortly after that, it became pirates, you know, in the Indian Ocean, or terrorism, or Osama bin Laden, or something like that. To people like me that worked on the survival of the planet for 40 years, the world looks very good and very calm.
But those nuclear dangers are still there.
They are, and I'm giving a speech about one of them in Moscow this month. And I'll just tell you one aspect of this. A year and a half ago, I went to a meeting with the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Gates, whom I much admire. I've been to his house in Seattle once, and I think he's a wonderful person. He was giving a speech, which he was reading, and I got up after the speech and said, Mr. Secretary, your speech mentions extended deterrence 3 times. The Cold War's been over for 20 years. Extended deterrence means we're ready at a moment's notice to order a nuclear attack on Russia's strategic forces to disarm them. We've been planning this for 40 years to prevent the Russians from invading Western Europe with conventional weapons. We were going to start a nuclear war ourselves and attack all their strategic forces to disarm them because we didn't think we had the conventional forces that would match them. But this was 20 years, the Cold War was over. Extended deterrence means we're extending deterrence beyond deterring attacks on us into deterring attacks on our European allies. And we don't have enough forces to do that on the ground, so we're going to do that with threatening nuclear war. I said, are we still threatening nuclear war, Mr. Secretary? You can actually see this on video, I discovered recently. And he said, well, this is for events that might occur in Eastern Europe. I said, yeah, that's what they always said for those 40 years. And he looked startled. And I've learned in preparing this speech in Russia, which is attempting to dismantle this doomsday machine. The doomsday machine is still there. They still got enough missiles to blow us to hell. And we got these missiles on absolute hair trigger alert. The submarines can fire on 15 minutes warning, and in 10 more minutes they'll be in Russia. So if the Russians get worried about this in a crisis, they would have to be impossibly nervously ready to respond because otherwise they would be disarmed before they knew it. So this is a very dangerous thing to keep all this in business. And I learned on preparing this talk this month that when I look at the posture statement, there was only one reference this year to extended deterrence. And one of my friends in the know said, actually, that reference shouldn't be there. So they, I think as a result of my intervention, they've stopped talking about this strategy, but they haven't ended the strategy. And I'm trying to arrange an end to the strategy. There's an easy way to end the strategy. I've been trying to do it for 10 years, and that is to lower the disarmament levels to equal levels on both sides of about 1,000 warheads. So if you just had disarmament to 1,000 warheads on each side, you could do it. But in fact, the Defense Department insists on maintaining 1,500 because that's the minimum they need to do this. And so they told the negotiators in the recent talks, don't go below 1,500 or we'll cause a fuss. So the strategy's still there. But I've been working for 10 years to prevent it. And I persuaded a prime minister of Russia to propose ending it. I got a prime minister of Russia to go to the Oval Office and say to Clinton, let's go to 1,000 on both sides. It was the most far-reaching disarmament proposal ever made in the Cold War. I'll give a lecture on this later and how this happened and what happened to it. But anyway, I'm still on the case.
Was that 1,500 missiles or 1,500 warheads?
More strategic deployed warheads.
Warheads.
In conclusion, I just want to say that what I'm trying to do in these talks, if I'm successful and my mind holds up, we'll have 50 of these talks because I have 50 chapters in these 2 memoirs of interesting adventures. What I'm trying to show people is, first of all, how the activists are motivated and how much luck and skill is involved in trying to make these things happen. And second, how your country and your society really work. Because I've come to understand that if you don't get into these inner sanctums and talk to everybody, you won't really understand, as you ought to, as it would be nice to, what's really going on. So thanks a lot for coming.